Hey guys, welcome to the second video for chapter 33. It's actually section 3, and in this one we're going to be talking about modern China and India. So the overall theme of this chapter is the developing world, and we discussed in the previous video how we associate the developing nations as being poor and lacking modern technology. China and India don't really fit into this category. Both nations, China especially, are large economies capable of generating tremendous wealth for people who live there, but both also have unequal distribution of resources and have large numbers of people that live in abject or just absolute poverty. Now, what's probably most important to note about China and India is the size of their populations. Both have over 1 billion people. Let's look at this pie chart here. Okay, so this is a distribution of the world's population with the largest nations. You see how China's got about 18.5%, India's got about 17.9%, and notice how we're third, the U.S., but there's a huge drop after 1 and 2 down to us. We've got around 300 million, but China and India China's got about 1.4 billion, India's got about 1.3. Yeah, I mean, you can tell just by looking at it. They make up roughly about 1/3 of the entire world population, just those two countries alone. So that makes them important players in the world scene, right? And it garners kind of paying a bit more attention to them. Let's first take a look at China. When we last discussed China, it was a strict communist nation under Mao Zedong and had undergone some serious struggles. Things started to change with several reforms. The reforms were spearheaded by this gentleman, Deng Xiaoping. That's the best kind of I can do with the pronunciation. Now, he came to power after Mao dies in 1976, and he was a much more moderate leader. He was more interested in improving the economy than imposing strict communist ideology like Mao did. He immediately set out to modernize the economy. That was his primary goal. His program focused on agriculture, industry, science, and defense. He wanted to build up the military as well. It involved several economic reforms. First, it allowed for some private ownership. Strict communism does not allow for private ownership. Remember the communes that we discussed back in chapter 30 with collectivization of farms and how they led to widespread famine and they were a bit of a disaster? They were all broken up. Now, the government still technically owned the land, but farmers were allowed to sell surplus crops for personal profit. Likewise, it allowed entrepreneurs, right, people who start up businesses to get things going. And because of this, Chinese were finally allowed to accumulate personal wealth. And that's why by the 1970s and 80s, you start to see Chinese millionaires that would eventually today lead into Chinese billionaires. Excuse me. Now, in a major shift from China under Mao, Deng welcomed foreign investors, right? Not only from Western nations, but from countries like Japan and even Taiwan. So you start to see things like McDonald's in Japan. You start to see marketing for companies such as Nike. It leads to significant changes as these foreign companies begin seeking out money that a nation the size of China could bring to the table. And this progression is still seen to this day when you see mega companies like Marvel, right, which is owned by Disney, specifically tailoring its movies for a Chinese audience. It's got 1 billion people there, right? If even half of them go see a Marvel movie, it's going to make more than they can make in the United States. Now, these reforms had several impacts, some good, some bad. Let's look at the positive impacts first. Overall, the reforms of the 1970s brought a surge of growth and created an economic boom. This was especially in trade cities along the coast. You saw cities like Shanghai. Beijing, was a trade city, not a coastal city, but they started to really expand, and you saw modern sky rises go up, and it became westernized in some ways as well. And there was also an increase in the overall standard of living. Now, this was not for everybody, but overall, we're talking about throughout the country. New products from overseas came flooding in, and more people were able to afford things like televisions, refrigerators, cars, things like that. Now, on the other hand, you did have some negative impacts. With an increase in money comes an increase in corruption. This is still a big criticism of China today. If you want to get something done, like get a business permit or build a new building, you routinely need to pay off government officials. And additionally, there emerged a widening gap between the wealthy cities and the poor countryside. You look at the chart here, 2005, okay, the rural per capita net income. Per capita income means, per household income. About 3,255 for rural, okay, meaning countryside, 10,493 for urban city. And you notice how there was a slight increase in the rural, but there was a tremendous increase in the urban. So urban was rising at a much higher rate than you saw in the countryside. The poor farmers weren't really seeing much of the benefits of this economic boom. One last impact was a conflict of ideas. Now, we're going to discuss this in greater detail within the context of Tiananmen Square. Now, first, some background. As Western companies flooded Chinese markets, Western ideas began to spread, such as freedom of speech, right? Here you see a demonstration and they're carrying a statue fashioned after the Statue of Liberty, right? So more of what we associate with Enlightenment ideals from Western Europe and the United States. So these began to creep more and more into Chinese life. This in turn led to a call for democracy, especially in the late 1980s. You saw a strong movement, primarily among university students, but also among some of the working class as well, for democratic reforms. Now, regardless of the economic reforms he put forth, Deng Xiaoping was still a communist at heart, and he would not allow these democratic reforms to take root. This growing clash of ideologies exploded in May of 1989 when thousands and thousands gathered to protest in Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square is a huge plaza at the center of Beijing, China's capital. It's kind of like similar to our Washington, D.C., right? This was a close-up, this picture here, of what you got going on right there with the statue. You notice also in the background the picture of Mao Zedong, right? So it shows his reverence in communist China, but all of these people are protesting kind of the strict communist policies and wanting some democratic reforms. So they raised banners and they called for democracy and so forth. Now, when the demonstrators refused to disperse, there was a very, very harsh government response. Troops and most notoriously tanks were called in. This resulted in the iconic photo that became known as Tank Man, when a column of tanks started to roll into Tiananmen Square, and this one gentleman here stepped out in front of them and tried to prevent them from proceeding. The picture was famously captured by a photographer, one of the few photographs that they have of that day. Again, an awful lot of restrictions on the press in China. The gentleman was eventually taken away, and no one knows what happened to him. Whether he was executed, fled into hiding, still held in some Chinese prison, we don't know. But this obviously became an iconic photo of resistance against Chinese oppressive government. By the end of the day, thousands were killed and injured, and many more were arrested and tortured. Now, Tiananmen Square showed that even though China now had McDonald's and Nike, it was still a repressive government, and that was not willing to give up the strict control that it had as a communist state. So China has seen tremendous growth, but it hasn't been all good and positive. Let's wrap up our discussion of China by looking at a few continuing challenges that China is facing into the 21st century. The most pressing one for the government over the last 30 years has been population growth. As I said in the beginning of the video, China has the largest population in the world with about 1.4 billion people. This can bring some benefits, kind of a tremendous variety in the workforce and a lot of options for different types of businesses and scientists and all that type of stuff. But it's a huge responsibility on the government to provide services for everybody. To counter this growth, China implemented a one-child policy in the early 1980s. Now, this kind of celebrated the idea you see with some Chinese propaganda here of only having one kid. Now, it was primarily aimed at urban families in the city. Rural families working on farms were allowed too. It's important to understand the policy didn't mean that if you had a second child in the city or a third or fourth child in the countryside that it was killed or taken from its family or anything like that. More than one kid resulted in a fine from the government, and you lost out on benefits such as tax breaks or better job opportunities. Now, overall, the policy did work in curbing China's population growth. Let me just get me out of the way here so you can see. There we go. All right, so the orange line represents the birth rate. The green represents the death rate. You notice here the Great Leap Forward in the 1960s when they actually changed. Remember what we learned about back in Chapter 30. That was due to the famine implemented because of the Great Leap Forward. The birth rate dropped precipitously, and the death rate because of the millions that died in famine. But then the birth rate skyrocketed again shortly afterwards. But you see how the birth rate by the 80s in the one-child policy, it steadily declined. So it has had the desired effect for the Chinese government in terms of curbing China's overall population. Okay. All right, so let's move on here and let's talk about industrial pollution. Urbanization, right? Urbanization is an aspect of industrialization. People move to the cities, they're looking for work in the factories and so forth. And, going back to the 1800s, some common problems of industrial urbanization are pollution, all right, aside with things such as crime and disease and so forth. China is the largest consumer of coal in the world, though. Its overall industrial growth has been disastrous for the environment. Pollution in cities is so bad that residents feel they have to wear masks while walking outside. There are days in Beijing or Shanghai where you can't see more than a couple of blocks because the smog is so thick. So this becomes a really, really serious problem going into the 21st century in order to curb things such as global warming. And one last challenge is the issues that they have with human rights. Now, this shouldn't be much of a surprise based on what we just learned about Tiananmen Square, but China is not known as being a protector of human rights. There overall is a lack of civil liberties, okay, such as freedom of the press, right? Restrictions on what you can say. Citizens do not have full freedom of speech in the press to the extent that we do in the U.S. And the government critics are regularly imprisoned as well. Also, Tibet is an issue. Now, Tibet, you see right here, Tibet considers itself to be an independent nation. China does not. China does not recognize its independence. They consider it just to be another region of the People's Republic of China. And this has led to a serious government crackdown on Tibet, particularly because of Tibet's Buddhist population. It's where the Dalai Lama is from, right? The leader of the Buddhist community. And China also, going back, especially in the 50s and 60s when it was a communist country, communism is opposed to religion. So they would not recognize Tibet's Buddhist official religion or the status of the Dalai Lama, and this has led to some serious human rights issues in Tibet. All right, so I'm actually going to hold it off there because we're already at 12 minutes, and I'm going to cut it off here, and then I will talk about India in the next video.